Great, thank you, Tom. Wait.
The next session is going to be moderated by Phoebe Yang from the FCC. And
Okay, great. Thank you, Tom. Well, it's appropriate that the final session of the first annual TPI Aspen Forum is about how to serve the underserved. For those who were in the first and second panels yesterday, you know that nearly all the panelists in the first panel came away with the notion that the measure of the health of a broadband ecosystem is not really how big or how fast the networks are, but if and how people are actually using them. And a key principle in the National Broadband Plan, which I had the privilege of serving with Nick Sinai and Scott Walston, and of course our fearless leader Blair Levin on, was that the value of a broadband internet lies in how it is used. And perhaps Laura Martin would say it's the network effect there as well. How many people participate in the broadband ecosystem helps determine the value of that system. So today we've got two giants in the space of looking at how to encourage broadband adoption, particularly in non-adopting communities. We've got Joe Wise, the Senior Vice President at Comcast for External Affairs and the Public Policy Council there, as well as the President of the Comcast Foundation. Joe has spent much of his career finding innovative ways to reach the underserved through education, training, and thoughtful approaches to encourage adoption. And we have Ray Ramsey, who needs no introduction either. He's the CEO of OneEcomony and a giant in the effort to bring broadband into the homes of low-income Americans, as well as the president of TechNet. And in those roles, he has been a leader in looking at how to promote local investment where really adoption begins and ends, and how to generate interest in broadband adoption at the community level. So we thought we'd do something a little different with this panel in the spirit of the unconference conferences. We're going to call this an unpanel panel and really keep it open for discussion as we go on. Oddly enough, I actually am going to start this panel with the statement that Laura Martin raised with respect to the USC Annenberg Center study that recently came out. Stating that reliance on the internet may have actually reached new peaks. She cited some statistics, which I also noted. 18% of Americans who are currently not on the internet, of those 18%, 39% had previously used the internet for an average of 3 years before stopping. And the number of previous adopters who are now non-adopters who say they will actually go back online after stopping has declined, quote unquote, considerably. I'm going to ask Ray to respond to that because that actually impacts significantly on your work, if that's true, and give us your thoughts.
Well, you know, I think, first of all, can you hear me? There are a lot of studies, you know, that are out there, and I tend to try to not spend my time refuting, you know, every study or trying to reinforce every study, because there was a recent study by Pew, once removed, that showed the adoption rate in the African American community had a big spike and then leveled off, showed continued increase in the Latino marketplace, and clearly low-income people moving online faster than anybody else. So looking at the plan, which of course you were part of putting together, and I hope we can spend time talking about it, the issue around adoption is interwoven with the issue around its relevancy and its applications. And when there's been some people who have fallen off, there's been a failure from the government side to focus on the application side, and that has a big impact in terms of adoption rates, particularly for those who are saying, it's not that relevant to me. And I would say for someone who is looking for a job, which is an increasing number of people in the country, a huge percentage of Fortune 500 companies will not take paper applications and will only do it online. So to those people, it's super relevant.
Joe, do you want to respond as well?
Yeah, I haven't reviewed the Annenberg study. I'll accept it at face value and just say, you know, if to the extent that people give up any service, you have to ask, well, was it the price, was it the relevance, was it the fact they just couldn't learn how to use a PC? What factors entered into it? I don't know if the study drills into that, but I think all of those are factors we have looked to address programmatically, certainly in the partnership that Comcast has with OneEcomony through digital connectors that we'll talk about this morning. I think the studies that suggest that the best ways to get people online are to take a holistic approach. You can't just say, here's a computer. You can't just say, here's cheap internet. You've got to teach a man to fish, I guess the old line is. You have to know how to use the internet. You have to be have basic literacy skills and digital literacy skills. Digital literacy becomes, I think, maybe arguably somewhat less of an issue as devices themselves take out a lot of the middleman. You know, if an iPad is simpler to use than trying to boot up a PC. But I think you have to look at the whole cross-section of issues, and if you consider adoption to be in the public interest, and I do, I also consider it to be in my company's interest, then you have to decide what it is that you're trying to drive toward. You also have to decide if it's in the public interest because it's really looking to serve a public purpose. And this goes to Ray's comment about the government, and I think picks up on something Blair said yesterday as well. We want broadband to be more relevant to people's lives, and just just Facebooking around with a couple hundred friends does not necessarily make it so for everybody. Though I did come across, as I was preparing for the panel, there's a woman, the oldest woman in Louisiana, named Mississippi Wynn. You can look her up on Facebook. Has 79 friends. I found out I have two mutual friends with Mississippi Wynn. But there are elements, especially as we talk about some segments of the unconnected here, including seniors. There are elements that are specific to the needs and concerns of each segment: the poor, non-primary English speakers, seniors, and so on, that you also have to factor into effective adoption strategies.
Great. Well, let's pick up on the Pew survey that Ray just mentioned. In that survey, 27% of Americans were found to have said that expanding affordable high-speed internet access should not be too important a priority for the federal government. 26% said the federal government should stay out of it altogether. What is the role of the federal government in adoption efforts? Is this really a private, nonprofit sector-led effort, or does the federal government have a role?
I approach it again from and let me just say this, because I wanted to say this in my opening, which even goes to the name of the session, sort of serving the underserved. I think it's the wrong title, and I've never viewed it as a matter of, quote, serving the poor. I think it's an issue of enabling people to have options and choices. And if you think about it that way, what we're really after is what will create the tipping point for the individual. And I'm convinced that when most people get exposed, have the capacity to be able to engage, most people will choose to engage, but some will choose not to engage, and that's okay if that works for them. So I never get caught up in the debate of, are we chasing 100% versus not? It's a matter of choices and options. And in this country, based on income, but also based on other factors, you have people who are socially and economically isolated, and that tends to reduce their options. So when you look at government has to step back and look at this and say, well, why is this important to us? Well, it's important because technology, and the internet in particular, is an efficiency driver. And increasingly, governments at all levels are dealing with stretched budgets, and they have to look for efficiencies. If they're going to deliver services to their constituency, then the internet in particular gives them expanded options to be able to serve the population better. There are a number of other issues. Just for example, demographically, as the country ages, you've got companies like, not to pick out different companies, but Intel, for example, spending a lot of time looking at aging in place. Well, as we have an aging population, if you're going to enable aging in place, you can't do that unless you've got high-speed connections that will enable some of the devices to be able to be in the home. And that's why I've always pushed for, when we were starting this whole, quote, digital divide movement, and I always fought against, well, let's just build a lot of centers. because the real tipping point moment is in the home, and the real applications that we're after, the 24/7 applications that meet people where they are in the home.
Joe, do you want to respond? Or you have a view on the federal government role?
Yeah, in more than one roundtable I've been on over the years talking about why the government should care in this space, at least one wise person in the room has often made a comment to the effect that if this is all about TV, why should the government care so much? I don't think it's all about TV, and I think the National Broadband Plan showed that broadband as an input has the potential to change America and the American economy in an extraordinary number of ways for the good. Beyond the, and the National Broadband Plan really should serve as a rallying cry, and I hope in time after we get past some of the politics of the moment that it will. It's a brilliantly done piece of work. You, Blair, the whole team deserve to be extremely proud of it. Very thoughtful, really research-based. And you took the holistic view. You said it's about deployment, you said it's about adoption, you said it's about national purposes. The government's role is particularly important in that last category. And if I'm not mistaken, you're actually serving on the executive branch task force to try to drive the plan forward. If our medical system can break down the barriers, things such as medical licensing and the failure of Medicare to provide reimbursement and Medicaid to provide reimbursement for broadband-delivered healthcare services, and deal with HIPAA issues and privacy issues that might stand in the way. If education barriers can be broken down, so the curriculum, talked a bit about Blair's e-textbook proposal yesterday, so the curriculum barriers do not stand in the way of the ability to more cost-effectively provide current and constantly up to the minute textbooks to individuals, and the smart grid and energy, about which there was a panel here. In all of those areas, government has a role in driving adoption because it's going to lead to more efficient services, as Ray said, and better taxpayer results. That should be the goal.
So there are a fair number of experts. There was a New York Times article written last month. There was a National Bureau of Economic Research study that was done in June that suggested that computer home ownership and/or broadband access actually has a negative correlation to educational test scores for students, especially amongst low-income households. How do we respond to that? You all have worked in the Digital Connectors program. What have you learned, and how do you see that study?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's when you look at these surveys, and I looked at that one very carefully, and again, I don't want to spend the whole time debating, what was in it. You've got bad educational outcomes when you slice it by income levels, which have nothing to do with whether or not the computer is in the home or not, and they didn't do a good job of disaggregating the data along that regard. And then the other issue is this is a human capital issue, which it's not about a piece of equipment. And so if, for example, when we bring the computer into the home, if there is no effort around digital literacy, and if there is no effort around, how do I maximize and utilize this tool, then you aren't going to find any particularly great results. And if the family isn't utilizing it and just letting somebody stare at it and play with it and not do homework and do those things, you'll get bad outcomes. So you can look at other things opposite of that. You look at efforts to bring technology into the classroom, and you can look at some of the increasing results that are there, Dell's connected classroom approach and a number of other things like that to disprove that. So I think the issue is make sure we put the basic infrastructure into the homes and make sure that we deal with the human side of this, which is the training and the literacy. And I know that Joe will want to talk about a widely fast-growing digital literacy initiative that Comcast is really helping to underwrite.
Great.
Well, I'd be glad to, Ray. I would say there's also a Romanian study I came across, a study of Romania by the University of Chicago, I think, that makes the same point. You give somebody a voucher for a computer, they take it home, they play with it, and the factors, again, and a factor you see over and over again in these things is what parental setting is being set at home. Parents need to engage, and this is true this is a challenge in all forms of improving education, right? Jesse Jackson will walk around and say the number one thing we need to do to improve education is get parents engaged. Same thing here. Parents need to know at least enough and understand enough and monitor enough about PC usage in the home to ensure that it's being used effectively and for good purposes. In programs like Digital Connectors that I'll be glad to talk about now, we try to achieve some of that goal through direct education of young people. And we should, I hope we'll talk a fair amount today. Carrie Sherman raised the thing yesterday I'd love to come back to about the need to generally teach digital etiquette, including appreciating things like copyright and cyberbullying and cybersecurity and being safe online. But in order to test the proposition that you do need to take a holistic approach to driving broadband adoption and making it meaningful and making it stick and getting more communities, more members of the community online, we did partner with OneEcomony on a program they created called Digital Connectors that was actually somewhat similar to a program Comcast has funded for years called City Year. City Year is an AmeriCorps program where students take 2 years off to be full-time volunteers, often working as teachers' aides in schools, and they get, in exchange for their public service, they get some scholarship support upon successful completion of their tour. What we liked about the way that Digital Connectors was put together is it was a way to bring in 14 to 21-year-olds, I think primary focus, to learn computer skills, to actually have the opportunity to get Cisco certification in basic computer skills, be able to break down and reassemble a computer and know how to put together a basic network. And to learn the communication skills of the internet and be able to produce video and so on, be able to use social networking effectively. But in exchange for these opportunities and the reward at the back end to get a netbook and a flip cam, they are also obligated to go out into the community for several hours a week during their tenure to proselytize for broadband. To be able to go to Ms. Wynn's house in Louisiana and say, there's this thing called the internet, it's pretty terrific. Look at all the things you can do with it. You can get healthcare services, you can connect with other seniors. Do you not know how to use a computer? I can give you basic instruction. Do you not know where to get one? I can help you with that. Do you need to get connected to the internet? Let's do that. So to have young advocates for broadband adoption going out into the neighborhoods is a massive penumbral benefit of the Digital Connectors effort. But it really is about, in this case, about digital literacy as a key component to driving this forward. Ray, you may want to talk a bit because building, I think, on some of the success of this, you and we and a number of other ISPs and some of the tech companies have actually put a proposition forward to NTIA that I think is worth talking about.
Yeah, and we're hoping, we haven't gotten an answer yet from NTIA, but it would be a wide-scale effort. It involves Intel and Microsoft and most of the carriers so that we would provide a low-cost PC to the individual, the first couple of years of internet for free and low cost, and then digital literacy training for the family. So it's really taking this adoption initiative in a box and building on all of our collective experiences and being able to expand it. And we've done something else which I think is really important, which is to target it toward where very low income people are, where the adoption rates are very low, and that's public housing and very low income housing. So you're able to focus on the infrastructure of buildings, to focus on getting the infrastructure into the home and dealing with the human infrastructure part, the training. So I think it's a very wise, scalable opportunity. If for some reason it doesn't get funded, I think the partners are all going to look at ways about how we can do this. We're all looking for ways to scale it. And again, this whole digital adoption space for me is all about remembering that I think it's important to meet people where they are. And I witnessed from the late 90s all the way through the last decade a lot of one size fits all, a lot of mandates for families, and really some arrogance, that would go with that, mandating things for people. And I used to, when I was fundraising around this, would say to people, if you think everybody is stupid, don't put any money into this. Because a lot of people would say, well, they're going to steal the computer. And I actually had somebody say to me, they're going to steal the computer. I said, that's difficult to do when you own it. So you would run into things like that, or they won't use it, or mandating things that nobody mandated what I had to do in order to get a computer. So it's remembering that the individual is still a consumer, and if we can reduce barriers, enable that person to make a tipping point, we're going to have a lot more consumers. And I've often, from a policy perspective, have said I call it the 3 C's. I said, if you're the for-profit sector, you call them a consumer. If you're a nonprofit, they're a client. And if you're a government, they're a constituent. They're all the same person. And so thinking about a common road to get at this problem, I think is good for the country, but it's less looking at it as a problem in the broadband plan. Again, I felt the most compelling part was the purpose part. And when I would have mayors, and I still have mayors, ask me, bring this program or bring these companies, in to do X, my first question to the mayor is to say to her, what is your compelling public purpose? What is the problem you're trying to solve? And then that's where technology and the internet and adoption strategies can roll in versus rolling a program in without understanding what problem we're trying to solve.
A related issue, what I think will make digital connectors a success is where and with whom you partner to do it. OneEcomony is the great national partner in terms of providing a curriculum and training of the individuals on the ground. But we made a concerted effort to go to, we knew that it's always going to be a challenge to work with schools. Schools don't have the time, they don't have the money, they don't have the resources a lot of times. They don't have the incentives because they're just trying to get through the school day, and everybody wants them to do everything. So the focus of digital connectors is really on after-school programs. And as we looked at those, we said, all right, who are the logical partners? We want to reach the communities that are so far least likely to sign up. We found that affiliates of NCLR and National Urban Leagues have been excellent partners because they're in the community. NCLR groups are often social service organizations. Urban Leagues are very focused on job training and often have computer labs available that we can piggyback on. And then we've also made a push on non-primary English-speaking communities. I think, Ray, maybe one of the most recent graduation events that David Cohen was telling me about, who's attended a bunch of these, because he's just so enthusiastic about the program, was in Dearborn, Michigan, where the target audience was primarily children of Yemeni and Iraqi immigrants. Mm-hmm. For whom this was an incredible breakthrough and an opportunity. And it was an all-girls class, mm-hmm. And we watched the graduation, and they were in sort of native garb, and the internet for them. And I had father come up to me, literally in tears, and saying that this unlocked his daughter, basically, and unlocked the world to her. And so, every time you see somebody like that, it easily answers the question: why are we doing this, and why is there a compelling public purpose for doing this? And just to say another thing about the connectors, it's got a curriculum that's made up of 156 hours of training. And now that curriculum is available online, and so the goal is that other organizations that it will expand virally. There are already 300 locations where this is beginning to happen across the country, and because of Comcast, it's expanding into more locations.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to hit on sort of the educational point, and specifically with respect to wireless. The National Broadband Plan found that the propensity to use mobile broadband was disproportionately higher in African American and Hispanic populations than it was in the average American population. And as we look, in fact, the current E-rate NPRM that we're considering asks the question, how should we look at wireless connectivity in the schools? How should we approach, both from a policy standpoint, but also from a private standpoint, the sort of role of wireless and mobile broadband in adoption efforts?
I'll speak, if you don't mind, on E-rate in particular, and which has been a really good program in terms of what it's meant for schools. And there are things that it needs to have done, in terms of modernizing it and making sure that there's more teacher training, I think, is one of the most important things. But also recognizing that the learning environment is a connected, broader environment than just the classroom. And I think if we can expand our thinking about where people learn and how they learn. It's not just sitting in the classroom. And I think if we could take some of the benefits of E-rate and smartly figure out how to export that to a wider learning environment, understanding the use of mobile technology, I think it's going to have explosively positive possibilities if we couple that with a real concerted effort around learning objects that need to go online so that people can access them in a mobile way. And again, thinking about the learning environment being a connected and broader environment in the community and in the home.
Yeah, as we discussed in the, I think in a panel here and in the wireless workshop yesterday, wireless means many different things, including Wi-Fi. And the cable industry, after 1996, after the passage of the act, said, we're grateful for the opportunity to have more regulatory freedom to go invest in broadband, and in gratitude, we're going to go out and offer a free internet connection to every school. 1996, that was something. But even then and today, of course, a lot of school facilities are old, thick walls. You can't start drilling. It's expensive to drill. You had some initiatives like One Web Day that have helped to extend wiring within the schools, but you've also have to innovate in a lot of ways with wireless within the schools. And as wireless becomes more robust, next generation Wi-Fi and what WiMAX can do and so on, I think wireless in all those manifestations becomes more important within the educational institution. And then outside the institution, again, I don't know what level of emphasis there has been up to this point by the government, by private entrepreneurs, by others, in terms of how to optimize the use of the handheld mobile devices for educational purposes. I think it's really time for a focus on that. I think some federal education dollars, some R&D dollars in that direction, if that's what it takes to stimulate the interest, would be wise. But I will second Ray's comment that E-rate has been a great success in terms of ensuring connectivity, but it's pretty much stopped there, and you got to figure out now where do you take it.
Great. I have a few more, but I'd like to actually open this up because there are a lot of people here who have some thoughts and actually have a lot of experience in this area. So let's open it up to questions or comments. Scott.
With these programs.
Scott, I think the host wants you to wait for the microphone.
With all of these programs and trying to accomplish sort of lots of different goals along with them, what do you have as metrics of success? What are you looking for when you start?
From a governmental perspective, or from a which it depends on which.
Well, pick one program that you've just described, and could be connectors, and how do you decide that an implementation was successful or wasn't? What are you trying to maximize?
I'll just give you an example because this can be disaggregated in a lot of ways, but with the connector program, we're talking about with the young people between the ages of 14 and 21. They do an assessment on the front end of the program and an evaluation on the back end of the program. The assessment is looking at where they are from a skills standpoint, and it's also looking at what goals, getting the person to set certain goals. So it might be going on to college, finishing high school successfully, getting through math, so you're setting a baseline when they come in, and then you're evaluating it at the end of the graduation, and then there's looking at it a few years, hence. And so the number of young people, because this program has been going on for a number of years, the percentage of them that have gone on to college is enormous. We can get you some exact numbers. The percent who complete is over 95% in terms of getting their certifications. So these are job-ready skills, for people in the marketplace. There are other markers in terms of looking at success. When you're looking at, for example, adoption rates, we've examined when you've looked at building in broadband into the home, and if you have subsidized it for the first couple of years, what will that individual do in year 3? And so we've got terrific data showing that after that, a huge number of people become real adopters, meaning they pay for it themselves. And so the subsidy doesn't have to go ad infinitum, which we've always argued against, actually. When other groups say, well, just keep it there forever and you've got to do these things forever, we're like, no, we want to turn a person into an adopter. So there's good data points on that. So there are a number of things to look at, as well as content-specific outcomes as well.
We said to Ray when we first sat down to talk about the program, we're not just looking to write a check or have a press conference. We want to see results. And Ray has laid out the fact that OneEcomony has done a good job of cataloging those results, and we were also working with them to find some folks who do some longitudinal studies. We want to see what the impact is over time. We also worked with Ray to get a social network set up around digital connectors, the Digital Connectors Club, which I think is built on the Ning platform, and somewhere north of 1,000 digital connectors participants are in it now. And we wanted to create a sense of community there, have them continue to inform each other and share the stories as they go forward about how digital connectors has changed their lives, get their ideas on how the program can adapt and be better and improve. So we as a funder have been very insistent on wanting to see results. The federal government, or any government, as it begins to look to where to put money in this area, should be equally demanding. I just read a pretty good paper, very good paper, and one of the few papers I've seen on this by Janice Hogg, I think it is, right, University of North Texas, and a colleague from Pepperdine, about measuring the effectiveness of demand-side studies. And it points out that we don't do a good job of it. We don't look for causal connections from the programs. We don't take real costs into account, including the cost of labor. And there's a lot of volunteer labor and support that goes into these programs. And it's time for some good, solid econometric studies. I'd love to see that for our program, for any federal. I hope the NTIA programs that are driven toward adoption will have the same sort of rigorous analysis. Because it's your money, it's taxpayer money, and it's just be spent well.
And 6 years ago, the Knight Foundation, it was maybe 5 years ago, the Knight Foundation concluded a longitudinal study where they followed 200 families, 100 in Miami and 100 in San Jose, who had gotten PCs in the home, had gotten training, and a couple of other interventions, and literally followed them for 2 years, did the pre and the post to see where they were. And there are a number of outcomes, and I could refer you to where you could review that. But the one that I was most intrigued and actually most happy about, because whenever you get these kind of evaluations, you're nervous, and I just wondered, what's the bottom line? But it was that there was this uptick in terms of the self-perception of the individual, their self-esteem, that sense that they were more in control of their own destiny. So there were some subjective type questions asked like that. And I said that to me was really important because, again, my approach to adoption, and I think one of the problems that I had in looking at the NTIA side of this was the failure to define what adoption was. And so, I took, when writing the application, I defined it as when the individual reaches this tipping point, this personal tipping point, where they will knowingly opt in terms of making the decision to go in and be an adopter. And so that's what we're trying to do ultimately with any of these things, with technology companies, partnering with organizations on the ground and local governments, is helping the individual arrive at a tipping point and not trying to micro our way through everything. And I think sometimes we look at it and it's like so daunting and we have to do everything. We got to do this, this, and this. And I can tell you one last anecdotal. When we were just getting started and we're very small at OneEcomony, because we started as 4 people in a basement, and we all had to wear different hats, but we had HP at the time give us 25 computers, and we were going to deliver them in Washington, D.C., and I'm not exactly a computer whiz, and I was blaming everybody else. So anyway, we got the computers delivered, but we forgot that we needed to hook them up and do some other things, so they were, quote, delivered. And then we realized that we had kind of screwed this up, and we went to look in the homes. They were all hooked up. The families had already taken care of, and many of them had made other purchases for educational software and things like that. And it was a very important aha moment, which said, we actually don't have to do everything. And this young generation are going to be huge engines of adoption. That was really the birth of the program.
Yes.
Thank you. Just to follow on Scott's question, we are at NTIA, in fact, just put out a solicitation for a 4 to 5 year evaluation of the BTOP programs, and we've asked. It was not a conceptually. It was not a simple evaluation to design, and we're in fact relying on whoever the successful contractor is to do a fair amount of the heavy lifting. There's not really, as you know, good consensus either amongst economists or sociologists who look at these kinds of impact issues about how to measure. I like it, the tipping point idea. That sounds really hard to measure. You would have been really mad if the NOFA said that you had to define tipping point, right? But you know, I think we're all
stealing a line from Malcolm Gladwell.
But you know, I think that what our aim is to be able to take the data that we'll get back from the grantees, the quarterly reports and the annual reports that we get from the grantees, plus the broadband mapping data, plus the census data that we've restarted collecting again. And I think we'll begin to get some sort of sense of how to detect impact of these new infrastructure programs and the other programs on local economic conditions and perhaps even some social factors, perhaps use of resources, anchor institution resources, healthcare, education, what have you. But I think it's going to be a really important 4 to 5 years. We've got a pretty interesting natural experiment starting because we've got all these funded programs where we've got baselines we can really track impact. But the caution I have to say that I feel is that we know how hard it has been to detect productivity impact from IT investments just generally. We know it took about 10 years to find it at all, and now we only seem to really have one model that people just keep using the same model over and over again, which is maybe not bad. But I think it's a really important research area, and we're certainly hoping that the work that we do will provide a lot of raw data for independent researchers to take a look at. We'll get one cut at it, but hopefully others will come along and take advantage of it as well.
You know, this is just one of the many areas, Danny, as you talk about putting out the RFP and stuff, where academics can play much more of a role in working with the government. And you know, I'll be spending some time at TPRC, as I'm sure other people in this room will in the next month or so. And I'm actually going to look to actively recruit some of the folks in there and say, you know, you can play an important role in this. You can get engaged in this policy process by bringing econometrics to the table in a meaningful way. And just start getting that community to think more. This is some really constructive stuff that academics can be doing in this space, as opposed to the 27th paper on that other topic we talked about for the last 2 days.
Any other? Yes.
It really is wonderful to see the work that OneEcomony has done over the years and that all of you are doing together. Assuming, as I tend to, that the FCC's authority over broadband will be established one way or another, what kind of role would the USF be able to play in this space? We currently have the Link Up and Lifeline programs, either through those or in other ways, assuming, you know, whatever authority barriers disappear. What would you like to see?
A lot. Do you want to start?
Well, I was just going to ask Phoebe to start it. I think
Yeah.
you actually have something in the pipeline on looking at the next phase for USF. Maybe you can
Yeah, I mean,
start.
as you know, there are 4 components to USF: the High Cost Fund, the Lifeline Link Up, which is really the affordability program, which addresses the adoption issues. There are also the education and healthcare funds, which really are about connectivity. But as we saw, and as both Ray and Joe have pointed out, the national purposes really fuel adoption. And to the extent, and even the Pew survey said that 76% of Americans believe that lack of broadband really puts them at a disadvantage in finding jobs, and 62% say it puts them at a disadvantage in getting healthcare information, et cetera. And so even the connectivity point really helps in those arenas. But as you know, also the Lifeline Link Up program currently cannot be, at least statutorily, extended to broadband services. So we would look to having that program also being addressed to being updated, really, for broadband purposes as well. But I wanted to ask, I'm glad you asked that question, because I actually wanted to ask the question about the national purposes and education and healthcare and energy, and how we can use that to fuel adoption. Maybe you have a response.
I have another question.
Oh, okay. Well, let's talk about these questions just momentarily.
Related?
Yeah, Ed, before Ed gets at the mic, hold
Yeah.
on. Is that, you know, again, this is something that I think the plan has done a good job of sparking, which is some of the low-hanging fruit that I think exists between the federal agencies working better together. And one of the things I've always tried to push, and we're still not where we need to be yet, which is HUD, and getting HUD to understand its inventory, and HUD making sure it never builds housing without making sure every unit has broadband in it, and looking at, and when we think about the public spaces, you know, when the FCC or any policymaker is thinking about, well, let's make sure we have broadband and libraries and other spaces. In the 21st century, again, we have to think of public spaces and those places of learning beyond just the traditional. And again, I look at HUD has housing authorities in every single congressional district, and we could make sure that all of those are places that people can access the internet, and we have equipment there by quality computers, people who are there to train, and those sorts of things. And so this broadband plan could do some of that, while we're also thinking about that housing inventory in terms of connecting it to be smarter housing in terms of the grid and those sorts of things. And so there's still a lot to do in terms of the low-hanging fruit of the federal infrastructure, and then plugging that into the state infrastructure, which is there. And I often look at housing because that's where people live, and it's an easy way to reach the population that we're talking about.
I'll come back to some of what Phoebe put on the table in connection with USF, particularly Lifeline and LinkUp. There is a role for subsidy in the broadband space, no question about it. It is easy to overstate the importance of subsidy when you look at Pew and other data. Affordability of broadband connections is a factor for maybe 7% of all users. 20% of the 35% that haven't connected cite cost as a factor. Cost of computers is similarly cited as a factor, about roughly the same percentage. Relevance is cited as the predominant factor, the 50% factor for that community. Non-availability is cited by maybe 7%, which would be roughly comparable to where we know we need to get broadband to through deployment. But so USF itself needs to be fixed for a lot of reasons. USF extended to broadband, we should figure out a smart way to do it, but in a way that is cost effective. We can overtax and overspend in the space very easily, and there'll be some political momentum to try to do that. I think we really have to work on a discipline that says we're going to, as in every program we're talking about here, we're going to ensure value for dollar.
Be targeted with it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
targeted. Yeah.
But we know that those are the key factors, right? Like the National Broadband Plan study actually found that cost was the leading factor, but digital literacy and relevance came very close.
Yeah, cost of actually I think it was a combination of cost as a factor if you add connection
Hardware,
plus computer.
Right.
But the broadband connection, which is probably the main thing we're talking about in terms of subsidy or USF funding, was actually a factor for I think about 7% of the unconnected. You can tell me
That's
if
a good point.
I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Ed, do you want to pipe in here?
Sure, I more had a question than a comment. And I'm glad we have two thinkers here who don't just have expertise in this field, but a lot of other fields with cross-cutting disciplines, and hopefully they can draw on all that to address this thought and question. There's obviously the net neutrality debate, which has been very prominent. I'm wondering, in what sense does the hardcore push on net neutrality, not the Google, Verizon compromise, but the hardcore push on that, detract from the ability to serve the underserved, in the sense that, or whatever, however you want to phrase it, to have people who have less money access broadband, in the sense that it makes it more difficult to either do advertising-based models, or it may make it so, like, when you have finite wireless capacity, it makes you do cost-based pricing in order to get around the bandwidth limits, so you have to charge more to deal with the fact that you have limited bandwidth if you have high bandwidth users. Does net neutrality really hurt the poor?
Oh, wow. No, I don't, Ed. I don't think, quote, it hurts the poor. What we have to be careful of is, again, this has taken up so much oxygen. And if you look at the broadband plan or the FCC, if we can get universal service, if we can deal with spectrum-related issues, and if we can deal with net neutrality, and I think we can do all three, there isn't going to be sort of a hurting of the poor. as an unintended consequence, which is what I think you're getting at. I mean, there'll be different revenue models. What we need to have for low-income people is attention focused on the kinds of applications that speak to their basic needs, that they need better in their life. And that's where government plays an important role, and it's got to get in that game a little bit more, as well as other agencies that aren't playing in that space, because it goes to the relevancy issue. And that's what low-income people need. And I think with some of these other programs, again, if we get the universal service and if we target that effectively, you know, toward the cost issues, and if we deal with human capital, we'll deal with 90% of what the low-income, quote, problem is. And I don't think that net neutrality hurts us in that regard.
Well, just to follow up on that, in yesterday's first panel, Commissioner Baker said that she believes that there will be an increasing shift from the free models to the pay models. And in the second panel, there was certainly an echoing of that view. Does that create an additional hurdle in adoption efforts, and how should we address that?
Well, you notice when I talked about apps, I focused on government and what the government needs to do and I did that intentionally, in what the government needs to do in terms of its applications and those sorts of things. Once an individual becomes an adopter, all the other kinds of amenities or options, they're going to review and they're going to make decisions just like they do now, with all due respect to Comcast and what their offerings are, or those sorts of things, which are pay-to-play, you know, models. This is about making sure that everybody has a baseline that they can participate in terms of being able to participate in the economy, be able to participate with the basic government things that they have a right to know about and a right to be a part of. And then after that, that's where the commercial space takes over and individuals will make their own economic decisions.
You know, a pay model online can be awfully darn efficient. I think, again, of the e-textbook situation where if we give a child an e-reader, I won't use any particular brand name, an e-reader when they start school, and that becomes the way to get up-to-date textbooks distributed at virtually no cost. You don't need massive book depository warehouses around. The dollars being spent on schlepping all that stuff around today can be put toward educating the kid better, rather than the physical carrying of books, better for their backs, all sorts of things. Then you want to see those models evolve, and I think they can actually, the whole point of broadband in government service is to deliver services more efficiently, more cheaply. Coming back to that phrase that Ed used that I will not repeat. But my biggest concern to date is how much mind share it has occupied at the time when, and I think Walter made this point yesterday, at a time when the National Broadband Plan, as well done as it is, as clear and focused as it is, should be the centerpiece of a lot of our discussion. I am hopeful that we are imminently at the point where the debate about that issue we can move on from it. I hope with the support of everybody in this room. Because we need to, and it can be done in a way. You know, as these conversations go on, I think that you can achieve the goals of an open internet, preserving an open internet in ways that don't diminish the investment incentive and do ensure innovation. So that should be the goal of this whole.
That's a great concluding point. Thank you all for staying with us.